go down. And speaking of medicine, tomorrow we've got a
Well, maybe the destruction of the entire planet isn't supposed to be fun. Maybe it's supposed to be terrifying and unsettling.
Oh, please don't do that.
And you should stay up all night, every night, crying when we're all 100% for sure gonna fucking die!
Hey.
Like everyone, I often get a sense of impending doom around the state of our planet, with statistics like 11 years to avoid a dire and perhaps irreversible climate situation, and with multinational corporations not moving nearly urgently enough or not moving at all to deal with this global situation, it can feel almost impossible at times. Sure, I say no to the plastic straws and use reusable bags when I go grocery shopping. I try to thrift and not buy new. There's this ultimate sense that this is perhaps way out of my hands. I feel helpless to the horrific negligence and complete unaccountability of corporations and countries that answer to short-term profit goals and not the long-term sustainability of life on this planet. I'm interested in culture, so I often wonder how we make culture works about climate change and how we are working through the sense of doom. I feel like a lot of the questions that are on our minds is how do we talk about climate change and represent it in a way that will make people care? In a world that prioritizes the short term, the spectacular immediacy of violence, how do we talk about something really violent that is happening much slower? And I think this is one of the fundamental problems that Don't Look Up is trying to contend with in the way that it tries to represent climate change. Like many of the critics that have talked about this film, I too don't think it was necessarily a successful representation. But why I don't think it is successful is what I think will get us to the heart of our difficulties in representing and discussing climate change. So let's do it.
It's only 4 degrees, it's only 4 degrees. It's only 4 degrees, it's only 4 degrees. It's only 4 degrees, it's only 4 degrees. It's only 4 degrees, it's only...
Don't Look Up is an Adam McKay satirical film about two unknown astronomers who are played by the very well-known actors Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio. Find out that a comet is headed straight towards Earth and will hit within about 6 months. They contact NASA, the head of planetary defense, and eventually find themselves in the White House with a presidential team who doesn't really care. They go to the media and try their best to get this story out. That the whole planet is in imminent danger if action is not taken to set the comet off the course it's on towards Earth. The movie is pretty much just a long series of frustrations in which the satirically ridiculous Trump-style government and the Elon Musk-esque smartphone billionaire refuse to listen to the scientists and just do all this crazy shit to benefit themselves and put the whole planet in danger. It works as sort of an allegory of climate change, and through this allegory deals with the complexities of how the media, American government, and politically divided public is dealing with this thing that is going to destroy the planet. From simply just a film critique perspective, I think the film is trying to deal with too many different issues and topics at once. Like, the film is 2.5 hours long, which is just way too long, and there's just so many plot lines and threads as it attempts to deal with everything from issues with the electoral cycle, the quirky Elon Musk type billionaire, the way corporations control government policy, the dividedness and political sloganizing of the American nation, the nature of celebrity and people caring more about their phones than the end of the world, etc. It's a lot. Also, it has like kind of major tonal issues where it sort of doesn't know if it wants to be a satire or have serious emotional resonance, and just a bunch of bit unnecessary celebrity cameos. Timothée Chalamet was brought in as Jennifer Lawrence's trashy skater boy lover who soon becomes her fiance because ? Anyways, this movie is trying to contend with, as I expressed before, how to talk about climate change in a way that gets people to care. And how it tries to deal with this issue is creating an allegory for climate change. An allegory sort of works as a long-form metaphor. It uses a fictional story to articulate another meaning. The story, if it's successful, is meant to reveal something and allow the reader to work through what you're really trying to express. Some classic examples are Animal Farm, the George Orwell book that, through talking farm animals who rebel against their human farmer, attempt to imagine a world of peace, equality, and freedom. However, this doesn't really end up working out, and they end up under the dictatorship of a pig named Napoleon. Orwell is trying to work through the Russian Revolution, and through farm animals discusses the issues with revolution overall. It works by taking this complex issue and showing it satirically through talking farm animals, so that we can understand it and work through these issues in a new way from a different perspective. A successful allegory illuminates something about what the story is really trying to express. In the case of Animal Farm, it tries to literalize the distinction between the animals and the working class, and the lowly way that the working class is viewed. When Napoleon and his pig comrades get a little too drunk on power, literally and figuratively, they start to become more human and start to step away from the animal tendencies and symbolically step away from the working class. Now, there's a lot more to Animal Farm, but this is an English class and you get the idea, so let's move on. So Don't Look Up tries to create an allegory for climate change through the story of an asteroid that is set to hit the Earth in 6 months. Through this allegory, it speeds up the slower process of climate change to an imminent danger that will happen in half a year. It uses this allegory not just to illuminate something about the way we understand climate change, but because it kind of needs to. How are you supposed to make a captivating blockbuster film about the end of the world that will happen over decades? And this is where it meets a lot of contradictions that are at the crux of the problems it's trying to work through. As it critiques the media that not only prioritizes fast-paced, flashy celebrity news, ignoring the unmedia-trained, not-so-flashy astronomers, it allegorizes climate change as this fast-paced, flashy thing. Rather than the slow form of violence it gets turned into something quick and spectacular, like an asteroid hitting the Earth. So now the problem with discussing climate change becomes present. In our fast-paced media and entertainment landscape, how do we talk about something that isn't flashy, that isn't fast, that isn't simple? And this is where Rob Nixon comes in. Although 11 years certainly doesn't feel like a long time, the effects overall of climate change are slow. Climate change isn't some one-time event, some big eye-catching violent thing that is even necessarily visible to us. This thing that will lead to the downfall of humanity if we let it run its course is slow. Slower than I think we can conceive. When a climate change denier says, "Give me an example of the effects of climate change in your day-to-day life," it might be difficult to pinpoint one exact thing. This violence is slow. It's slow glacier melts, slow sea level rise, slow sinking of islands and coastal cities, slow diminishing of wildlife, slow extinction. It's not a spectacle, at least not in the way that the media in our fast-moving world imagines spectacle. Robert Nixon, a professor at Princeton University, published his groundbreaking book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where he talks about just that and more. Within the book, Nixon contends with the difficulty of violence that happens slower than we would even consider violent. He explains, "By slow violence, I mean a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Violence is customarily conceived as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular in space, and as erupting into instant sensational visibility." These types of violences that work hand in hand with climate change are a lot more complex and a lot harder to identify. The violence of climate change works slowly, and Don't Look Up seems to be struggling with this fundamental problem. How do you represent something that moves slowly through time? What gets lost with the asteroid metaphor, and what the film I think misses, is the why of climate change. The asteroid as an allegory becomes extremely reductionist. It makes climate change just this disaster that is going to happen, with the reason for why we are here completely anonymous. Furthermore, it also assumes that climate change as this planet-destroying event will affect everyone equally, which it won't. So first, what does this slow violence of climate change look like, and who is most vulnerable? Brie Deschanel posted a really good video on fast fashion where she goes in depth discussing how countries that are considered in the global south, which technically aren't even all south, are strategically exploited by the global economy so that the global north can remain wealthy and access affordable products of the likes of fast fashion, and corporations can make a shit ton of money. Without being too repetitive with what she expressed in the video, this exploitation is certainly a fundamental place to start in discussing these forms of slow violence and how we got here in relation to climate change, and moreover, why we struggle to discuss or depict it. Climate change is deeply wound up with the exploitation of the global south that finds its origins in colonization and necessarily capitalism. Like in Broy Deschanel's video, a good place to start is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. There's often this dominant idea that poor countries are just poor. They've always been like this, and it's our job as developed countries to help them with charity, World Bank loans, etc. But Rodney details meticulously in his book how continents like Africa, that often get used as offhand comments for the abject poverty of this world, weren't always quote-unquote underdeveloped, but through slavery, colonization, and exploitation by Europe became so. Colonization destroyed indigenous agricultural systems and ways of governing in order for Europe to extract resources and human beings through slavery from Africa to develop the countries of Europe and later North America. And of course, extraction of resources happened in many other nations in the global south. Basically, so-called underdeveloped countries purposely were made that way so that the developed countries could be developed. Even when Europe officially left these countries and colonization officially ended, big air quotes here, they were entered into a global economy that certainly was not working to their favor. The rise of neoliberalism in the 80s with world leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan prioritized a free market economy and furthered the project of colonization. The free market is an economic system that is based on supply and demand with little or no government control. Newly independent countries across the global south, as recent as 1975, were impoverished because of the exploitation and destruction of their countries during colonization. The World Bank then provided structural adjustments where they would give loans under the guise of alleviating poverty to so-called underdeveloped countries. The loans, of course, came with a catch. The World Bank would have control over the country's economy and make sure their markets remain free, leaving the countries with little control over their own economies, among other things. Although colonization and slavery as this spectacular display of violence and horror ended, the effects of colonization persisted in these forms of slow violence, the violence of the free market and economic systems. As an example, Nixon discusses the violence that takes place in Jamaica. Yet the most consequential rival is hardest to depict. The advent of the free market in the form of IMF structural adjustments, rendered visible by planes disgorging federally subsidized American milk, onions, and potatoes at prices that destroy unsubsidized Jamaican farmers whose operations were small-scale but intergenerational. To compensate for the resultant agricultural collapse and the rising debt that follows from importing more subsidized American food, Jamaica must increase its dependence on tourists who disgorge from sleek jets or then immured into dedicated pleasure zones. The violence experienced by Jamaican farmers and the Jamaican people remain a lot harder to identify. For a country that colonization ended in 1962, the violence of capitalism and economic systems continue this legacy long after the British officially left the shores. So what does this have to do with climate change? Hi, Papa.
That's you. No meat. Top.
Oh my god, thank you. You can just put it down here. I'll eat it later.
이제 무만 이거 먹어.
I love you. Thank you. Korean grandparents, y'all. Well, as discussed before, climate change is deeply connected to the exploitation of the global south and indigenous peoples by the global north and multinational corporations that do the exploiting. Let's take a look at the agricultural industry. Before, it was discussed how subsidized and cheaper American food that was made subsidized because the World Bank controlled the Jamaican economy put Jamaican farmers out of business. And this is happening in agricultural industries all over the world and is becoming an increasing problem. The palm oil is a classic example of the way exploitation and climate change are interconnected. Palm oil is extracted from the oil palm tree and is a hugely profitable business, growing in tropical climates like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Huge amounts of deforestation result so that the oil palm can grow, creating in where once was a biodiverse rainforest a monoculture as far as the eye can see. Clearing the land through cutting down the trees and setting fire to the land creates huge emissions of CO2 and is increasingly leading to the extinction of the orange orangutan. When this issue is presented by the World Wildlife Fund, you get a lot of sad pictures of baby orangutans that pull at your heartstrings and hopefully pull at your wallet. But other than a few cursory facts about palm oil, little about the why and also the complexity of the why of the orange orangutan's critically endangered status is mentioned. What isn't talked about is how economic systems increasingly make countries in the global south dependent on cash crops like the oil palm tree for income due to structural adjustments, free market capitalism, and the erosion of indigenous food and governance systems that is increasingly leading to the destruction of rainforests, biodiversity, increased CO2 emission, and the horrible working conditions and pay of the people that work in these industries. The slow violence that is a lot harder to depict and throw on a poster. The why of climate change and its entanglement within these world systems gets increasingly abstracted because slow violence is often a lot harder to depict and definitely not as eye-grabbing. Corporations and countries often use this to their advantage to evade responsibility. A skinny polar bear on a lone ice block speaks little to holding anyone or anything responsible. As Nixon expresses, together, these practices have heightened capitalism's innate tendency to abstract in order to extract, intensifying the distancing mechanisms that make the sources of environmental violence harder to track and multinational environmental answerability harder to impose. Gradual casualties are spread across a protracted aftermath, during which the memory and the body count of slow violence are diffused and defused by time. So let's return back to Don't Look Up. The movie sort of gets halfway there. It attempts to tackle the difficult nature of discussing climate change within our sensation-driven media technologies. However, its allegory of the asteroid, I think, does more harm than good in getting people to conceptualize and discuss climate change. Responsibility within the film is made super abstract. It tries to poke some blame within the hyper-patriotism of America, but an asteroid in the sky has no reason. No one is responsible but the cosmos. And this abstraction within this allegory collapses the nuance of climate change and covers up responsibility of the economic systems that led us to this point. It does this while trying to critique the very lack of nuance and shallowness of media. Moreover, this asteroid is this global event that will destroy everywhere equally. I think in its satire of patriotism, it was trying to critique the self-centeredness of America and trying to express the way that this issue is bigger than regional concerns. It affects everyone, and we need to work together as a world. Which is true, but unlike an asteroid, climate change won't affect everywhere equally. The countries that are most exploited and have contributed the least towards climate change will often be the countries that will feel its effects first, and are most vulnerable to volatile weather conditions, disasters, rising sea levels, etc. And other than a few montage clips that the film lends to other countries, it rarely allows a moment of screen time for any other countries in the world except for America. Can the subaltern speak? Guess not. This issue is global in scope, but it won't affect everywhere equally, or at the same time. And the question of time is super important here, because climate change happens over time. It's hard to face this feeling of oblivion at this speed of violence. And if this violence is slow, it really matters what speed we're addressing this violence at. At the end of the film, the astronomers are unsuccessful. Their efforts are thwarted by a demagogue presidential team and greedy billionaire that don't prioritize peer-reviewed science. The end is really intense as you watch these group of people sit around a dinner table enjoying their last meal together and quite literally face oblivion. Maybe this is sort of a weird comment, but the end of the movie didn't make me feel good. And I know everyone, and specifically Adam McKay, would say that's because it's not supposed to make you feel good. As Jennifer Lawrence articulated, you should be really fucking scared. Climate change is imminent and your future is at risk. But what I think is one of the major issues with this movie is as it attempts to satirize reactionary, highly emotion-based politics, I think the end really demands a reactionary state of being from the viewer. In general, I definitely understand this climate change logic. We must be vigilant, we must be scared, we must remain aware and take action. I left the film with my heart racing, my whole body in fight or flight mode. I stayed awake for hours, unable to fall asleep because of how much anxiety I felt. The question is, how do we talk about and get people to care about climate change if the violence operates in this slow way? And honestly, I don't think the answer is to prioritize urgency, immediate reaction, and fear. In my last video essay way back when, I discussed the meme "No Thoughts Had Empty" and the way that I felt like it was kind of this reaction to a world that demands our immediate and constant attention to the multitude of issues and our inability as humans to process those levels of information. The main point I brought up in that essay was that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. In her essay, Audre Lorde is specifically discussing the way that within the feminist movement, difference is often erased in the name of a collective struggle and for collective rights, and the ways that white women, in the name of taking down patriarchy, step over queer and women of color. These tactics of shoving other people to the side so you can access a sliver of rights is a tool of the very systems of oppression they are trying to fight. So how do you expect to dismantle these systems if you're using their tools? These systems of oppression, such as capitalism, prioritize a state of being in time that is hyper-productive and fast-paced. Think grind culture. So why in activism online do we prioritize this fast-paced way of interacting with issues using the same tools to take down these systems? To return to slow violence, these fast-paced modes of existing in the world that demand high productivity, fast-paced media, and short-term profit are often what makes it difficult for us to notice these modes of slow violence. In working through climate change, we want to dismantle the master's house, the systems of colonization and capitalism that led us to this point of environmental destruction. And I hate to break it to you, but we can't use the master's tools, y'all. Slow violence demands a response that is local, long-term, and slow. This doesn't mean that we just close our eyes to what's happening or delay the real sense of urgency, but to understand the way that this violence operates, we need to be moving slowly as well. We've already seen kind of the quick, flashy ways we deal with these issues lead to climate change becoming nothing more than a trend that we can quickly dismiss once we're over it. What I meant when I said that the end of the movie didn't make me feel good was not that it made me uncomfortable, because I think discomfort can be helpful, but it was that it put my body into a state of fear and anxiety and made me want to shut down, not show up for the world in any meaningful way. And again, the film critiqued the fear-mongering politics of Meryl Streep, but it kind of made the same move. In general, I just really don't think any meaningful change can be built on a rhetoric of fear. Again, if we want to dismantle the system, we can't use the same tools that built it. This doesn't mean we have to spread like false positivity or act like everything is going to be fine, but it's moving people through a sense of collectivity and love rather than fear. I'm not into science, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know how to solve climate change, but I do know that we must be a part of embodying the new world we want to create. We need to be able to move slowly and allow ourselves to detect and be perceptive to the violence and the action we can take within our communities and within ourselves. However, I am into understanding representation, and Robert Nixon emphasized the power of using symbols in discussing climate change. The problem isn't that Don't Look Up is trying to create a symbol for climate change through allegory, it's just that the allegory was unsuccessful in the way that it understood time. So what now? An example Nixon used in the book was the Green Belt movement in Kenya, founded by Wangari Maathai. Wangari Maathai, along with indigenous women, led a grassroots movement of planting trees to combat desertification and soil erosion that was leading to increasing food insecurity. It advocates not only for environmental concerns, but civil rights. The desert's steady seizure of once viable fertile land also stems from the local forms of slow violence, deforestation, and denuding of vegetation. And it was at those junctures that the Greenbelt women found a way to exert their collective agency. As the drivers of the nation's subsistence agriculture, women inhabited most directly the fallout from an environmental violence that is low in immediate drama, but high in long-term consequence. The tree offered a symbol that reflected a long-term and slow response. A tree doesn't grow overnight, but moves intergenerationally through time, a gift from one generation to the next. Tree planting served not only as a practical response to a nutritional environmental calamity, but to create, in addition, a symbolic hub for the political resistance and for media coverage of an otherwise amorphous issue. The tree represents an alternative meaning of growth, not the short-term growth of governments that are expending and extracting finite resources from the country, but growth that is long-term and slow. Our ways of representing and creating possibility for sustainable life on this planet matters. We need to prioritize slowness and the long term, not only in the way we move in our day-to-day lives, but in our symbols. Shifting fear to empowerment and agency, shifting urgency and trends to slow long-term solutions and multi-generational change. So in conclusion, Adam McKay, your film is not the serve you think it is.